Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I know you all are coming from different parts of the world, different time zones, so appreciate you being here. I'll make it efficient, and I will hopefully make it engaging. So chime away in comments, good, bad things, questions, things you agree, disagree with. Anyway, the reason I'm here is because we all live in a world in which there is too much data. And too much data actually leads to three kinds of problems. The first problem is this problem we call data discovery or data discoverability, which is like, man, I got like too much data and no one in the organization knows what data I should use and what's trustworthy, right? And the first solution to this is data documentation. We're like, oh, we're gonna have like anywhere from a wiki page to a Google Doc to a data catalog, and we'll document our data so it's easy to use. But it leads to a new problem, right? The new problem is these docs are incomplete, and I don't know how many of you love filling out documentation, but I rarely come across people who love filling out documentation for the sake of filling out documentation, right? So that's problem number one, data discovery. Now, the second problem is tied to this is that data team often becomes a bottleneck for analysis, right? Because you don't know what data is trustworthy, that becomes tribal knowledge. Because you don't know SQL necessarily as a product manager or as a marketing manager, you find that that those people have a huge barrier to access data in the company, right? So what's the solution? We're like, oh, SQL education and self-serve, right? So all of a sudden you're investing in these boot camps for the company, new hires and other employees who don't have data in their title are learning SQL. But it leads to a new problem, right? These people, these business users are very good at their domain. Like, I'm a marketing analyst, I'm very good at marketing, and maybe I'm very good at Excel. But like, you teach me SQL, and my skill set may vary on a spectrum, right? And the third problem is this problem that we as data engineers face that's more upstream. If we, some of you have done software engineering in the past as a discipline, as in, obviously we're all software developers, but we've developed like product code, right? And in such a case, what we see is there are a lot of tools around product software development. You would find GitHub and CI/CD, which tells you whether the dependencies are met. You will find Lint. You will find all these other things that make it very easy to have confidence that what I'm deploying is good. This, by the way, it wasn't the case 20 years ago, right? But in data, it's the same case that was the case in software development 20 years ago, right? And our solution is, oh, data contracts. But data contracts are a very process-heavy construct for bringing alignment between data engineers and product engineers. And most organizations don't want to follow such a heavyweight process for all their data. Maybe there's one or two data sets or data products, as you call them, that exists, and you will have collaboration there, but that's not the true case, right? So the reason I am here today is to talk about these problems, and then we have tried using LLMs to solve some of those problems, so I'll tell you how that went. And then if you are also curious about how you may want to use LLMs within the company for side projects based on learnings that Semma has had on using LLMs to try to solve these problems, then there are some learnings on you on the best practices, things we have learned that you should do or not do that apply to you. So that's why I'm here today, and I hope you ask questions, disagree, and agree. Okay, so what makes me the guy who ends up talking to you? And that's because I played a big role in creating these problems, right? So I started my career in data working at Cloudera first. I was an engineer on Spark. From there, I went to Lyft. So at Cloudera, I was building mostly sort of data platform systems. And I found that at Lyft, problems were less around platform and more around, I got so much data, I don't know how to make sense of it, the three problems we discussed just now. To solve those problems, I launched an internal project at Lyft, a data catalog is what we call it, which helps with those three problems. And that project was called Amundsen. Now, that is named after a Norwegian explorer who was the first person to reach South Pole and therefore the first person to reach both poles. Turns out no one can write or say that name right, myself included. So you can say it Amundsen, Amundsen, and if you're Norwegian, all of those would be terrible ways of saying it. That project was pretty successful and used at a bunch of different companies once it was made open source. And from there, I wanted to make that solution, the next generation of that solution, available to the larger market. That led me to found Semma and launched the Semma data catalog shortly thereafter. And today, I'm just solving the same set of problems that I've been trying to solve since almost a decade ago. And to give you a sense of the kinds of companies that I gain experience from, maybe your company is listed here, maybe your company is similar to them or a competitor of them, and that sort of maybe clouds my perspective as you go through this. So like maybe your company is different, much smaller, much larger, much different domain, and these learnings may not apply. But Amundsen was used at Instacart, Lyft, Brex, Square, so on and so forth. And Semma is lucky to have customers like iRobot, SoFi, Grafana, Airtable, Convoy, and Tempo. And so that's some of the places that I've spent a lot of time working. Okay, I'm also going to put my phone on airplane mode. That's always a good idea. Cool. So here's a question for you, right? Like this talk has two parts to it, and I'm curious which part you are more interested in. The first one is you want to learn how to handle problems related to too much data in the organization, and you want to see what learnings and tools have seen help the companies or not. And the other one is you're more interested in just like general learnings around working with LLMs and AI tooling and want to see like best practices there. So I'm curious to hear, put it on chat if you're here more for A or for B, or if it's a Friday and you just feel like I'm here for everything, maybe put A and B, but let me know which one you prefer though. And while you do that, I'm gonna continue going on and tell you a little more about what we have coming up. Cool. All right, so the agenda for today, the talk is divided in 3 sections. So the first thing is I'm sharing with you about predictions for LLMs in data and how they impact the 3 problems we talked about, as well as how they impact data more broadly. The second one is learnings for using LLMs. So if you are interested in B, the topic number 2 and topic number 3 are most relevant for you. And cool. So I'm getting it seems pretty evenly distributed from what I can tell, and some specific questions. So we'll cover all of those. All right. So first of all, I'm going to jump into 3 predictions about how LLMs will change data. And the thing to note here is that in each of the predictions, I'll talk to you about what technologically or organizationally needs to change in order for those predictions to be true. And the first prediction is that the chat will become the new user interface for business users. Now, on its own, this doesn't sound like that, maybe like different of a prediction than you've seen like maybe 50 chatbots that query data. But there's a lot of nuance to this. So first of all, like why is chat so exciting? The first one is like we've all used ChatGPT probably, and simple and familiar interface. And there's already proven ability to work with LLMs in this way. And it's very little barrier to entry. But I think there's actually a big problem and an opportunity before chat solves it for all business users. By the way, the reason I say business users here is like I actually think that analysts and other data savvy users will continue to use SQL with a more co-pilot-like experience when querying data. And that's because SQL is structured and it puts very clear bounds on what I'm going to do and not going to do. And maybe my process of writing SQL will be a lot easier if I'm an analyst. But business users who we have been forced in line with the problem 2 that I showed you in the first slide to learn SQL, to learn gotchas about our data, those users are all going to start using chat, right? And the big problem that people talk about in LLMs is hallucinations. I actually think hallucination is not the problem when it comes to the obstacle we need to overcome in order to make chat as the main data access mechanism for business users. The problem is the business user today has these questions, right? Like, which is the rides table that I should be using? There's like 50 of them. What's the right column for the ETAs that we measure in order for me to find the actual ETAs of Lyft rides? And the same questions are actually going to apply to LLMs as well. So I don't think it's hallucinations that we need to solve here. It's the context. Context is king here. And the LLM needs to know what data is trustworthy. Now, the good news is that generally a good modern data catalog will provide information about usage of data. It will provide information about who uses what tables, what columns are the most popular, which ones have the most dashboards on top of it. And these information has historically been served to catalog users via a UI. Now, this information will now start being served to LLMs so that they can use this information to build a model of which data sets do I use and which columns do I use, what metric definitions do I use to serve that answer to the business user. And I think that change in access patterns of data catalog information to LLMs is going to be the one that is going to be the main blocker or opportunity to overcome when it comes to using chat interfaces for a business user. Now, just because I say chat, it doesn't mean Slack or a Slack-like interface. In fact, I believe that it needs to be a much richer chat interface for this to actually be useful. And here's an example of this. Chat must imply use to succeed. So in this image, what you're seeing is a chat interface, but that's built for writing an essay. And so the chat needs to have three things in order to be successful, at least three things. The first one is it needs to be context aware. That means if I am in a marketing department or in product management or in sales, that it needs to know what my role is. It also needs to know whether I'm doing a quick and dirty analysis or if I'm doing an analysis that needs to go to the board, right? And that will change the interaction, the data, maybe even the data sets or the analysis they would use in order to give you that thing. So that's context. Why are you here? Who are you? And how can I help? The second one is affordances. This tells you what you can and what you cannot do. For example, if I'm a business user and I work in marketing, I may not have access to demographic data, which may be limited to only the product management part of the company. And that's because demographic data may be used to show different prices to different people, and that's illegal, so I'm not going to do that. But for product management, if I want to choose to find out how many certain people in certain demographic group are using our product, that's allowed, right? And so affordances tells you what you can and what you can't do, and that needs to be an important part of the chat interface, because if I slap a big block of text, empty text box for you, it doesn't tell you what you can't do. And the last thing is it needs to be in the flow. Now, if you're writing a Google Doc, that means that you get suggestions as you type. If you're writing an analysis, that means you're getting Copilot experience when you're doing that. But in this case, for business users, this would be if I am looking at a Salesforce dashboard, that it's very easy for me to ask questions and update that dashboard and sort of correlate those two together at the same time. So these are the three. This is heavily influenced by these two blog posts, which I linked to at the bottom. But those are the experiential things that need to be true in order for chat to succeed. So that's prediction number one. Let's go to prediction number two. Prediction number two is data will be truly democratized. So the thing is, we've been talking about business users will be able to use data for decades. And being honest with you, that actually hasn't been all that successful. And the barriers have been the same things we've talked about all day today, right? There's lack of understanding around what data is trustworthy and fit for purpose. And then there's a lack of deep expertise in SQL, which unfortunately is needed to use data. But I think with AI, this is now possible, and I'm very optimistic about it being democratized. So to democratization would need that a person who has domain context, like a product manager or a marketing person, is able to use data to make decisions day to day, and that these people have the training and skills necessary in order to do that, and that we are using the same metrics that a technical person, like a data analyst, would use for the business users as well. And in reality, what's happening today is that there are two kinds of business users. There's ones that lean on the data analyst for their analytical needs. So, right, so this sounds like, oh, I'm going to buy you coffee. I'm just going to like build a relationship with you. So like maybe the analyst will answer my questions and you're just always requesting the analyst. But the problem is the analyst is not the bottleneck, and that's not an easy role to scale. Oftentimes as organizations scale, they don't want to grow the analytics org linearly as the organization's needs and data are growing. The other thing is, this person becomes a pseudo analyst, and that often is a good thing, right? Like you want them to be enabled, but also like they don't have the entire context. So sometimes what you'll find is they'll come to the meeting with some interpretation of one metric or some data, and then the data analyst or a data engineer would be like, well, that data source was deprecated like a month ago or a week ago, and it leads to bad decisions based on it. And the challenge in this particular area of democratization is actually hallucination. So while the first one, we needed context, the second one is we actually need to be able to trust what the LLM is doing. And while there's a lot of literature on this topic outside of this conversation and broader than data use of LLMs, I think that's an area that will need to be solved in order to solve this problem. Okay, now to prediction number 3, which is help desks will continue to be run by humans, right? So thus far, the first two problems, I've been pretty optimistic about AI, and then you may ask me, what's the point of humans then? And I think there's a lot of engagement between data users and data engineering teams today. And actually, if you look at, we did the analysis of these questions, there's actually maybe 5 different categories of questions that are asked the most, right? The first one is the data discovery type of questions. Do we have this data? Where do I find this data? Then there's some usually access-based questions like, hey, I think we have this data, but how do I get access to this particular data or this particular dashboard? And then there's a slew of other questions. There's like questions around data quality, which is like, hey, like who owns this data? Or does this data look right to you? And so on and so forth. And what I find, if you look at these questions, some of them will be answered by AI, but actually a good chunk of them would not be. And you need knowledgeable humans to actually provide judgment on questions. And so what we found in our deploying of LLMs in our product was that LLMs are good at sorting and classifying comments, right? So if I have these list of 5 categories of questions and a question comes in, GPT is pretty good at being able to say like, hey, this looks like a question for an access request. This looks like a question around clarifying data quality. And then GPT is also very good at crafting an immediate response based on a knowledge base, Q&As that you may provide it already, or additional metadata, which is like data-related metadata, but could be organizational metadata. So it could be like, these are all my trusted tables, or it could be that this person is in this organization or has this title or reports to this other person, so on and so forth. And that helps LLM give good answers. But the thing that LLM is not good at is it's not good at converging, right? It's actually very good at diverging, which is the exact opposite of what you want. So when you say like, hey, should I be using this table or this table? And it would be like, actually, you could be using the 2 tables you said, but you could be using the 3rd table as well. And you're like, I just needed help in figuring out which one of these. And you did exactly the opposite, right? And so I don't see LLMs actually helping converge anytime soon. And I think converging is a judgment call based on scenarios. And so we need people for that. And that's the main place where I see interaction between data engineers and data users coming in handy. So those were my 3 predictions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to different section of the presentation, which is around learnings we've had from using LLMs. And so here, I'll start with what I think are LLMs good at and LLMs bad at. So the first one is LLMs are good at content generation, right? We've seen this anywhere from images to marketing text to essays. We've all done that. So that's the obvious one. The next 3 are actually less obvious, so I want to talk about them. The first one is summarization. I provided a SQL query, and it can summarize for me. These are the easy ones. I provided a long email. It can summarize for me. But this can apply in data as well. You can go anywhere from Slack threads that need to be summarized to contents of the tables that need to be summarized. The next one is categorization, very similar to the classification of Slack messages that I was talking about. Give it 5 different categories of things and give it a new thing, and it will categorize it pretty well. And the last one is translation. And translation obviously means like English to French, but it also means English to code, English to SQL, and the other way around. And this actually has profound implications in our world, right? So not only can I think we talk a lot about English to code, so I'm actually going to talk about code to English, right? So thus far, a business user has to read the ETL in order to understand how a table is being populated, where does it come from, what does that mean, so on and so forth. And like honestly, most business users can't do that because like it's very nuanced. And I don't know about your SQL queries for ETL, but mine are always more than 100 lines long. And so what you can do now is you can make that particular ETL query very accessible through structured and unstructured ways. So structured is like a lineage graph. Here's the query, here's the table, and then it comes from these 3 different tables, or here's the column, and it comes from these 5 different other columns, right? But you can also provide qualitative feedback. You can say like, okay, based on this, I'm reading that this thing filters out this particular simulated rise. It's also filtering out any rides that happened before 2010 and so on and so forth. And that is a very good way of translating. I find that the response of an LLM is a lot more trustworthy when you provide it context that's guarded, right? So you can say, here's a query, explain this to me. The chance of hallucination is a lot lower, except when you go maybe a little open-ended, which is more of a generation use case. That's when you don't really know whether you can trust something or not. Now, things that LLMs are bad at, the first one is like knowing when they have to say, no, sorry, I don't know. By the way, this is a problem we have as humans as well sometimes, right? We need to know what our boundaries are, and LLMs are particularly bad at that. So I guess a gentle reminder to all of us humans, myself included, to know our knowledge limitations and be humble about it and not be like LLMs. But they are bad at that, right? And the way you can circumvent that is by forcing a translation instead of a generation. The other thing they are bad at, which is not obvious, is math and statistics. Now, obviously, you could do 2 + 2 and I'll tell you 4. But if I gave it like a column and I said summarize this column or average this column or like provide a mean value of this column, can't do that, can't trust it. That still needs to be a structured SQL query that you write, and then maybe you take the result of that query, plug that into an LLM, and get something useful out of it. And the last one, which we talked about before, is like converging on a path of action. Very good at diverging, not very good at converging. Converging requires judgment. Judgment is human. Cool. So how do you deal with these limitations? One way to deal with these limitations is fault-tolerant interfaces. And that is that you assume that you understand what faults and at what probabilities those faults can occur in your system, and you account for that in your design. So here's an example. Y'all use Spotify. Spotify gives you predictions on which song you should listen to next. And it knows that my predictions are going to be wrong 20% of the time, right? And that means that you need to show enough options on your screen so that people have at least one good option or at least 3 good options. So there's a product decisions, how many good options I need to have. And then there's a fault tolerant decisions, knowing the accuracy of your model, right? And the thing about LLMs is like, at least today, we don't have insight into what is the accuracy of LLMs. And you may actually, when you develop an LLM application yourself, you may build that model yourself. So you don't, LLMs may still be a black box, but you build a model of how accurate it is by learning from your users. Did you show the right suggestion? Did they actually accept your thing as a code suggestion? So on and so forth. And so what you need to do in the meantime is work with that and build a model of what is the accuracy, and then using that model, change your interface design, right? And so I'll show you an example of what this looks like. So this is a feature in our product. It's called Discover Assistant. I'm not going to actually talk in super great detail about what this feature is. You can check this out at semma.ai and see it for yourself. But essentially what we do is there's a description of a table that's put in by a human that's curated, and then there's an AI generated context that's generated. And by the way, I separate these in our product, and I think it's an important point, so I'll talk about this. Curated descriptions and automated descriptions are actually separate entities. You should not be able to promote that to a curated descriptions, because curated has a much higher bar of trust, and it has a much deeper like tribal knowledge that's not in a software system style information that's put, while context that's generated by AI, it's only from existing content that you provided it, whether that's the SQL query that's used to populate the table or dashboards built on top of it, so on and so forth. Anyway, on the AI part, what we want to do is we want to build a model of how often people like these descriptions or not, right? And specifically, we want to know if the description is inaccurate. So there's a way to report that the description is inaccurate, and you can do that. And that helps us figure out like, okay, 10% or 20% or 3% of the descriptions are bad, right? These are all made up numbers. I actually don't know this model is being built. And based on that, maybe if we figure out that, 10% of descriptions are bad, like one description is fine. But hey, man, like if 50% of descriptions were bad, maybe we need to show 3 descriptions and have people choose which one is the one they want to see on top, or have it and discard the other 2, so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by a fault-tolerant design. And once you know it, you will see it in all interfaces that use ML AI, right? Anywhere from your recommendation systems and Netflix, Shinrad's past employer, to obviously data catalogs, the ones I'm more familiar with. Cool. Here's some more best practices for you if you were choosing to use LLMs to use at work or life. The first one is summarize and translate instead of generate. We've talked about this a bunch, but that's probably the biggest takeaways. The second one is that there's actually a slew of information that you can find in other literature, like around step-by-step reasoning and asking the LLM to explain how it's thinking. I'm not going to go into those details because there's plenty of literature already. But the other learnings are that you want to meet your users where they are. Like it's usually pretty hard for you to push users out of their existing habits. So you want to meet them in the flow and show the work that's leading up to the input. So in the example that I shared with you in the past, for example, here we are showing you an AI-generated description of a table. We're actually showing that this description was generated from the query that was used to populate the table, and you can look at the actual query here, right? And that's all slapped right there, right? And those are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind as you are building LLM applications. And then some takeaways on LLM tools, like there's a bunch of tools that are coming up, like you can find LangChain, Llama Index, Microsoft Semantic Kernel as some examples. I lump them here together. I think these products are very good for a fast prototyping, and like you don't really need to understand the gotchas of the machinery underneath the hood. So like a good place to kind of kickstart. But we also found in our development that there were frequent regressions on these, like LangChain in particular, like you find updates like very often. And those updates have pretty common regressions and surprising ones, sometimes minor, sometimes major. And so it just doesn't seem like it's quite ready for prime enterprise use. And the second one is that all of these create unnecessary modular abstraction. So what I mean by that is like, hey, if you wanted to do some arbitrage of LLM providers, right? Like I want to use GPT-4 from OpenAI, and then I also want to like use Anthropic's latest model, and maybe I want to be able to switch back and forth very quickly between them. And then like, yeah, I will use LangChain, right? But if you're like, hey man, like I'm gonna be just on GPT-4, and maybe that comes from OpenAI, or maybe that comes from Azure, but like that's really where I'm at. And like I think there's a lot of just unnecessary abstractions that you have to use, especially as you build your own expertise of using this technology, that makes less and less sense for you to use these tools. As to whether you use OpenAI versus Azure, it's like a question of reliability. And I remember when we were developing this thing, our engineer Boyan, who is in Europe, would say like, "Oh, I had a great time until the US woke up, and like, goddamn, I can't use it after that." So like, hopefully that situation improves. But we did find Azure to be much more reliable than OpenAI's version. But overall, man, like finishing the talk here, like I'm an AI optimist. There's a bunch of shortcomings, but I think LLMs can add a lot of value today. We built a bunch of new things in our product that specify that. And there's like new descriptions that are LLM generated. There's like a summary of a lineage graph node. Like often you're looking at a lineage graph and there's like it's like super big and you're like, I don't even know like how to make sense of it. So like the experience has to be good. But then you often want to click on an edge and be like, what does this edge represent? Like, is that an ETL job, or is that like a one-off query, and what query was run here? And so we did a whole bunch of understanding of that lineage node that was very helpful today. So I think today, with the limitations and the best practices I shared, you can get a lot of value out of a data product. And ours is an example of that. It doesn't have to mean that you take the human out. It's actually like enabling the human to be a lot more effective and efficient. And a little bit of context can go a long way. In fact, sometimes the more context you provide, the worse it is. So choose a guarded context, share it with the LLM, and it has a lot of benefits. To share an example of what's happened with our product is like, we've been able to document a lot of data that was previously undocumented, and AI-generated content was generally preferred, and users were super delighted. So here's an example of a user we have had, customer Jordan, who's just been phenomenal. Anyway, you can check out more of this at stemma.ai/demo. I know there's a bunch of comments and questions, so why don't we jump into that? But thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, for the talk. I personally really enjoyed it. This is super mind-blowing for me. I've learned so much about LLM and also this data discoverability today. So we do have a couple of questions on the comment here, but because I'm the host, so I'll take priority on my own question here. Okay, so my question is, honestly, from my experience, from my day-to-day life, one thing that's really challenging about like getting answer to an analytical question is about the source of truth. Because a lot of times, you might talk to different data analysts, depending on really what project they work on or how close they are to the domain. They might give you a different definition for one thing. Like I could ask, hey, how many daily active user do we have? And maybe in one space, they use a user who watched maybe in the last 7 days versus 14 days. And that's the really challenging part of being able to have a source of truth for one metrics, so that you don't evaluating using a different metrics in different report and causing confusion. So yeah. I'm curious, what's your thoughts on that when it combines with LLM in this topic?
Yeah, I think so. The first problem here is actually a problem that LLMs don't solve and would not solve, which is there's this conversation around source of truth. I actually think this is misleading because organizations, like you already alluded to, Shinran, have multiple sources of truth. Because if I ask a marketing person who's a user, any website visitor is a user. But if I ask a product person who's a user, no, like paying users are my users. Why the hell do I care about who shows up on the website?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so what we need is what I refer to as fit for purpose, right? And so a user data set for marketing fit for purpose may be different than the user data set for product fit for purpose. And sometimes it's a data set, sometimes it's a metric, and the metric definition may change and evolve. And I think those will remain the case. And my general recommendation to organizations is to not think of it in terms of like there's only one way to like count number of users, but think of it like what different domains have that similar question and how we want to make that answer fit for purpose. And by the way, it's like this is a long effort. So you just say like, hey, I'm just going to start with product people. Your marketing, you're going to be just like out on your own, like doing your thing the way you have been thus far. And I just tell you like this is a metric for measuring users for product, and we'll deal with the rest tomorrow, right? And that's an okay answer too.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your thoughts here. So I remember we have a question from Jose about using LLM for support. So he has a comment talking about like from using LLM for like automated support perspective, it will be good to use it for tier 1 or maybe tier 2, but not for tier 3, because some of the limitations you talk about, like it's very good at diverging at some point. It's not very good at making a decision or something. I'm curious, like, what's your thoughts on that?
I agree with that, though. I haven't thought about it in terms of tiers. And most data help desks are not structured in tiers. Like, I think if we were talking about customer support for a SaaS product, then we were talking about like tiers. I think of it more, again, in terms of like convergence and divergence and how much you can rely on a knowledge base that already exists. And to the extent where tier 1 and maybe tier 2 already lean on an existing knowledge base, I agree with Jose. And I think in tier 3 as well, like I think unless we talk about the types of questions, like I would not be surprised if there are types of questions in tier 3 that can be answered by LLMs. But I think in general, questions that require convergence or judgment, those are the ones that are the hardest ones for LLMs to answer and not being answerable by them in the near term.
Yeah, great point, Mark. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Okay, actually another really good question from Jose. So what about BART? Have you tested OpenAI versus BART and open source MLM versus some Prime usage? Which one would you recommend?
I have no experience with BART, and we didn't test it. Like we were just the product that I am sharing learnings based on today was, has been in conversation and development for a bit. And at that time, like OpenAI was a leader, and we just chose that. So I don't think I'm qualified to answer about BART or any other open source LLMs for on-prem usage.
Yeah, and the goal was also to roll out to customers. So there was a reliability and delivery was one of the considerations that you had. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Honestly, from a week from now on, you don't know what other company gonna pop up with another large language model, and you could be leveraging. And another thing, coming back from one of the really great points Mark made during the presentation, there's no way that you all know all the options out there and had the time and possibly space to test all of them out. And it's okay that we don't know sometimes, and we'll be continually exploring, continuous learning.
Yeah, I just read this quote yesterday. Oftentimes when you think you need more data, all you need is more courage.
That's a really good one to try out. Okay. There's another question from Paul. How do you measure your LLM performance, and how often do you retrain the LLM? Okay, so
actually, this is a great question. I'm going to talk about the second part of this question first. When I first started using LLMs, I come from a traditional data world, and from my understanding of ML models was that there was always training involved. And so when I started using LLMs and sort of working with the team at Semma who was building these products, I still assumed that in order to get value out of LLMs, that there would be a lot of training, which they call fine-tuning in the world. And I think the biggest learning for me has been that there's so much you can do with just prompt engineering, right? So even that case that I was talking to you about classification, like you may imagine that I have to train the model to do classification, right? But like a simple version of the classification is just like in the prompt, I say, by the way, here's the 5 different ways of classifying, and here's examples of each of those classifications. Can you classify this new thing, right? And so one thing I have come to realize is that 6 months ago, the number of times and scenarios I thought I would have to fine tune the LLM was a lot higher than what I think now. And therefore, to the extent where a posed question around LLM performance is tied to fine tuning of the model, that's not super relevant. But measuring performance to changing of the prompt is very important, because either back end of the model we upgrade from turbo to the next thing, or 3.5 to 4, and that may change a lot of things, or we find one small little tweak to the prompt to change one thing, and that ends up changing a bunch of other things. So that is very important, and that's it's just like sort of testing frameworks, right? So you have like what's expected, different kinds, and then you have comparison frameworks as to like this much time, or these many tests passing, or this much coverage area, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I could add a little bit to that, just in terms of measuring the success. It's the success is whether or not it's useful to the people using the catalog and the people maintaining the catalog. And as Mark showed before, there is a feedback loop. So if people find that it's not useful, they can check that, and we get to see that. But I think going into it, there was a lot of trepidation about putting AI content in the catalog for users. And as was shown earlier, it's separated from the user-generated context, the user-generated documentation. And the expectation initially was that it was going to be less useful than the documentation that people were creating themselves. What we found was that a lot of users really like the documentation, and that there's a long tail of tables that have very simple documentation, and the AI generated context is actually more useful. And so we have a measure open to see if it's not useful to people, and people start opting out of the context, and we really haven't seen that yet. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and Rob. I think we have gone through all the questions we have in the comment, and I just want to give a shout out on this feedback survey that we just shared in the chat. So it's a very short feedback survey, but if you can just take 1 minute to fill that out and give us feedback on the presentation, on the event itself, to help us improve our future content, that would be super helpful. So please do take 1 minute and fill out the feedback survey. So Mark, I'm going to maybe throw a little bit of a difficult question on you to close this event. Sorry, maybe I should have made you more prepared. So, I know, Mark, you wrote this book talking about Hadoop architecture, and you have experience, in the past as a software engineer and also data engineering. And now that you are using AI to build, tools like data catalog to make data teams, make it easier for data teams to discover data, and also just different aspects of the data world. So I'm curious, how do you see all this AI-based products in all the data tools around will change maybe the scope or definition of data engineering? Honestly, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the tools that you use already day to day, it's a given that they're going to have some AI assistant in them, right? And I think that AI assistant has existed. I mean, that's not a new thing. Clippy was there when we were kids, right? In Microsoft Word, and so everything is going to have Clippy, for better or worse. Hopefully, they make Clippy much less annoying. And so I think that doesn't really change anything in your workflow, except maybe it makes you more productive. And I also don't think it necessarily, the help it provides is more I think of it as more of an autocomplete than it's going to make design decisions for you, right? the place where I get personally excited as a product person is places where it changes your workflow completely, right? And it's like, oh, because AI is like an example. I'll share an example. It's easier to contrast with examples that are already popular. So like, I'll share an example in marketing, right? A marketer previously had to take some snippet of a positioning, which is like, oh, we are the modern data catalog, and then write copy for ads that go in various different channels, which is like Facebook or Reddit or a blog post. And there's a set of tools that exist for doing various parts of each of these workflow. Rob can probably recite all of them at night to you. But like, what's happened is a new set of technologies have come that are powered by AI and that have led to just a totally new workflow. You just feed in your positioning. You're like, who am I targeting? And then there's like 5 different kinds of things that spewed out, and then you can integrate them and you can send them to each of those channels, right? And I think those are the more foundational changes that are interesting and exciting, because people building clipping in their products are just like scratching the surface. And I don't think in the long term they are the meaningful places to invest. And what are those new workflows and how are they going to evolve? Honestly, that's a crapshoot. Like, that's experiment. That's where the fun comes in, right? Like, you build something, you throw it out, and people puke at it, and you're like, okay, well, that was not it. And then you try again, and you're like, oh, that was not either. Maybe you'll find something. And I think that's really how I think innovation would happen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. There's one line you said there, I think it summarized really well, and I totally completely resonate with, is that I think all the emerging AI tools there is going to make the data team more productive, more effective, and can help us maybe even get rid of not having to work on the repetitive or tedious tasks that we didn't originally enjoy, and working on more the meaningful part that we enjoy and can make better decision on. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. And I think at this point it's a good time for us to conclude this event. And I would just want to say, Mark and Rob, thank you so much for being here today, sharing your insights with us. Maybe in the future we'll bring you back again once you've just learned more from experimenting with AI in the data discovery space. And I also want to say thank you for everybody who attended this webinar today, and please take 1 minute and fill out the feedback survey so that help us understand how we can improve our event and what other content you want us to share maybe the next time. And this might be a little bit cheesy, but I just want to share this message that Marcus talked about in his presentation. I think many people right now who's working in data struggle with one thing. They're just so many involvement going on in different spaces. There's so many new tools coming out, so many new concepts. And it's okay, you don't know everything. And that's totally okay for us to say, I don't know something. But what's more important, to keep going, to have the courage to keep discovering, keep learning, and step into a space that you never learned before. And that curiosity and passion will take you really far. And today, maybe don't forget to say, I don't know to one thing and learn something new. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. And I'll see you next time. And have a good weekend. Bye. Bye, everyone.